Okay, well, good morning, everybody. And here we are in Wyatt's Distance Learning Studio and Coffee Emporium, ready to go for another digging deeper lesson by remote control. And again, I'm got my coffee. I have my fountain pen. I have no ink on my hands yet. That may change as we get started. And I hope everybody's doing well. Just want to suggest that we may try this next week on Zoom. Denise and I are both doing some things on Zoom with our classes, so you might take a look at whether you've got a Zoom account. We'll still have a recording available that we can post on YouTube for those of you that, for whatever reason, can't do Zoom. If you've got questions about how Zoom works, give me a holler. I'll post some links as we wrap up this lesson and I post the video. So thanks for those of you that made comments on being astonished. I promise it doesn't have anything to do with me. I don't intend to be too terribly astonishing today, but it made a good hook line, and I think you'll find that it'll make sense by the time we get to the end. We're going to start this morning in Luke chapter 8 as I continue to do something different than our Psalms and Samuel study for a bit. Luke chapter 8 is something that Pastor had preached on, not long before we had to take this hiatus. So all of you are probably familiar with the story. It's a common one anyway. It's where Jesus was walking, and Jairus, the synagogue leader, came to him and said, "I need you to come take care of my daughter. She's very sick." As he went, the lady with the issue of blood came, and she was healed. And then we get to verse 49 of Luke chapter 8, and it says, "While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. 'Your daughter is dead,' he said. 'Don't bother the teacher anymore.' And hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, 'Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed.'" And I want to focus just for a minute on that word, afraid. Don't be afraid. It's the word that we commonly use now, phobia. That's what that word is. And Matthew really likes that word. He uses it a lot. Matthew used it when he was talking about the announcement of Jesus' birth to both Mary and Joseph, when Gabriel came and said, "Fear not." For those of you that used to watch Touched by an Angel, you can picture Tess saying in that voice that only she had, "Fear not." And, that's kind of easy to say if you're an angel that's maybe 8 feet tall and gleams like lightning, to look at a mere human and say, "Don't be afraid." And Matthew also talked about in Matthew chapter 14, verse 27. Let's look at that for just a second. You should see my setup here. I've got Bibles. I've got Bibles on my iPad. I've got things printed out. So if I pick up something and start reading from it and it's not scripture, it may be a bill or something else. Anyway, Matthew 14, verse 27. And this is another story that we're familiar with. It's when Jesus was walking on the water, came out to the disciples, and let's start, what did I say, 27? I'll start with 25. "During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to the disciples walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him, they were terrified, afraid. 'It's a ghost,' they said." That's not a bad interpretation when you see someone walking on water. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Same thing that we found that he was telling Jairus back in the story that we read. And then Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. So Jesus had just said, don't be afraid. But the circumstances were such that Peter was. He was afraid. The wind, the waves, the whole situation was enough to make him afraid. So clearly it's easier said than done to not be afraid. If we go on to Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 through 31, this is again is another passage that we're real familiar with. It's when Jesus sends out the 12 to go preach, and he tells them to not be afraid. In fact, he repeats it several times, and he probably needed to repeat it several times, because in verse 16 he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. You're going to get flogged. In verse 19 it says, when they arrest you. In verse 21 it says, brother will betray brother. And then he starts saying, don't be afraid. Okay, I've just told you several reasons that things are going to go wrong, and I'm going to tell you don't be afraid. In verse 29 through 31 of Matthew chapter 10, it's one of those verses that, again, is very quotable. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So, don't be, what? Afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. Don't be afraid. God knows the number of your hair. He knows where you are. Don't be afraid. You're worth more to him even than the sparrows that he keeps tabs on. Matthew 17, 6 through 8 is another one. Matthew 17, we'll go to verse 6. And this is a different situation. Jesus has gone up to the top of the mountain, and Moses and Elijah appear to him. And what are the disciples? They're afraid. Terrified is what it says in NIV. They had heard the voice where God said, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. The disciples heard. They fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them and said, get up. Don't be afraid. So one last quote about this afraid business comes from Teddy chapter 20, verse 3. And when the pandemic comes, don't be afraid. And even though that's not really scripture, it's something that I think if Jesus were here now and someone were inspired to write down scripture, he would tell us that this is not a time for us to be afraid. The scriptures that I did read is that he tells us not to be afraid in the face of what nature does. Probably all saw the stories yesterday about the tornado in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Those places that it hits are places that I know well, roads that I traveled. Denise and I were both in school there for a couple of years. But we don't have to be afraid in the face of what nature does. We don't have to be afraid in the face of what God does, just like what he did on the Mount of Transfiguration. That was a special thing. And while the disciples were terrified, God's response to them was, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And like he told Jairus and in other places, don't be afraid in the face of illness. We studied the names of God some time ago. One of those was Jehovah Shalom. He is our peace. This is a time to embrace God as our peace. and that we can put fear aside and embrace Him. So don't be afraid. So there's the first part. Now, the second part, and again, this is one of those times that I would stop and we would talk, and I miss being able to do that. And maybe we can do that a little bit if the Zoom class works out right next week. So if we go back to our verse in Luke, where we stopped after "Don't be afraid," we know what comes next. The next part of that statement is just believe. In some translations, it says only have faith, and she will be healed. Just believe. Now, believe is not a word that we are unfamiliar with. That one, believe, is as good a translation as any. It can mean entrust. It can mean it can mean have faith. We're used to seeing that word all through Scripture. For example, John 3:16. We know that one. For those who believe, same word. But I'm going to go to James for a couple of other examples of this. It's, again, a very common word in Scripture, and we're going to look at James chapter 2. And James has been talking about the whole issue of what does it mean to have faith. And in this verse, starting in verse 18, someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do." You believe, the same word that we're talking about, that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe, same word, that, and shudder. Okay? Those are the same believe that we're talking about back in Luke. And then he goes on to talk about Abraham, what Abraham did to demonstrate or express his faith. And in verse 23, and Scripture was fulfilled that said, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. And what is James talking about? Verse 22. Abraham's faith and his actions were working together. His faith was made complete by what he did. So when Jesus tells Jairus, just believe, it's not a passive just believe. Jairus had to follow and go along with Jesus. He had to allow Jesus into his house. There were feet that went with his faith, actions that went with his faith. Since the corona shelter in place or all of the restrictions have come in place, one thing that's been circulating on the internet fairly widely are some purported quotes from Martin Luther from the 16th century. There was a time when an echo of the plague had hit Wittenberg. It was about 150 years after what's commonly called the Third Plague that decimated Europe. And then with the plague, anywhere from a third to a half of the population of an area that was struck by it was expected to die. And if you could imagine today, that if we were seeing a death rate 10 times higher than what we've seen so far with the COVID virus, that people, if you looked outside and you would expect that 1 out of every 3 people that you saw, you wouldn't see shortly. It's a very different situation. And someone had written to Martin Luther and asked, what is the Christian's response? Should we flee from this plague? And like the meme that you may have seen on social media says, he said that he was going to both stay and serve and take the precautions. And I'm going to post the link to the entire pamphlet that he wrote back to the person that had asked that question, because it's very, very enlightening, and it's something that I think would Christians would do well to read. like many of Luther's writings as far as that goes. But he covered a lot of territory in what, when you read it, sounds a lot like Paul, if you ask me. And I'm not claiming that Luther's writings were necessarily inspired like Paul's were, but his pamphlet reads a lot like one of the epistles that Paul would have written. But the point that I want to make here is in believing in the face of fear, setting aside fear, putting actions to our faith. I think Martin Luther nailed this, and he had a perspective that we can adopt. And about halfway through this 8 pages worth of really dense writing of Luther's, he says, because we know that it's the devil's game to induce fear and dread, we should in turn minimize it. Take such courage as to spite and annoy the devil and send those terrors right back to him. And we should arm ourselves with this answer to the devil: go away with your terror. Just because you hate it, I will spite you more by going the more quickly to help my sick neighbor. I'll pay no attention to you. I've got 2 heavy blows to use against you. The first is that I know that helping my neighbor is a deed well-pleasing to God and all the angels. By this deed I do God's will and render true service and obedience to Him. In other words, in your face. You can try to bring fear. You can bring whatever you want in the face of who I know to be Jehovah Shalom, and my answer is going to be to obey Him. I am going to do this service as it pleases Him. And then the second blow against the devil is God's mighty promise by which He encourages those who minister to the needy. He says in Psalm 41, see, you knew there would be a psalm, didn't you? And this is Martin Luther quoting Psalm 41, verses 1 through 3. Blessed is he who considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in the day of trouble. The Lord will protect him and keep him alive. The Lord will bless him on earth and not give him up to the will of his enemies. The Lord will sustain him on his sickbed. In his illness he will heal all his infirmities. Are not these glorious and mighty promises of God heaped upon those who minister to the needy? So, again, in the face of an illness, a fear that there were orders to quarantine or orders to stay away from people, Martin Luther says, I'm going to continue. I am going to reach out to the needy. I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay away when I can, but I'm still going to do God's work. I do encourage you to go read the entire thing. It'll take you a little while because it's a lot of work and a lot of words, but it's very, very insightful. Now, that seems like a pretty good place to stop. However, I haven't hit astonishment yet, and I promised you that we would have astonishment. So if I go back to Luke chapter 8 and finish this story of Jairus, in verse 51 it says, when he, Jesus, arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her, and Jesus said, hush, she's not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But Jesus took her by the hand and said, my child, get up. Her spirit returned at once, and she stood up. Jesus told them to give her something to eat, and her parents were astonished. And that's the word that I wanted to end on, astonished. And it's not the only place. It is a fairly rare word in Scripture. There's only 16 other places that that one shows up. And a few of those are worth looking at. If we go to Matthew 12, 22. Matthew 12 and verse 22. Is that right? Yeah. So they brought Jesus a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, and Jesus healed him so that he could both talk and see. And all the people were astonished and said, "Could this be the Son of David?" They were astonished at what? That Jesus had healed a demon-possessed man. Her parents were astonished when Jesus raised the little girl from the dead. Mark likes this word more than anybody else in the New Testament. Mark 2, verse 12. And again, it's a time when someone was healed, the paralytic man, and Jesus says, "Take your mat and go home." And the man got up, took his mat, and walked home. And this amazed everyone. Same word, amazed, astonished. Let's see, Mark 3 and 21. This is an interesting one. Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that his disciples were not even able to eat. And when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, Jesus, for they said, "He is out of his mind." Or in some translations, beside himself. That same word that is translated astonished or amazed can also be beside himself. And you can see how those relate, that they were describing his behavior as being beside himself. And then finally, Mark 6:47. Mark 6:47. Uh-oh, did I write the wrong one down there? No. So this is again a different relation of the story of Jesus coming out to the boat. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The fourth watch of the night, he went out to them walking on the lake and was about to just walk right past the boat. But they saw him walking on the lake, and they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. They were afraid. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." And then he climbed in the boat, and the wind died down, and they were completely amazed or astonished. So why am I focusing on that? 3 things out of this morning's lesson. Put aside fear. Go, walk, do in faith, and prepare to be astonished at what God does. No matter how much we can anticipate what he does in and through us, or in and through all of you, we can't help but be astonished at what he does. And that's what I want to leave you with for this week. Look for what God does. Look for examples that are astonishing of what he does through his people. And in this time that everything's upset and unsettled, there is still room for God to astonish people. And that's what I want you to look for. Pray for you guys. I hope you have a great week. I'll post links to the video and to Martin Luther's text a little bit later. And look forward to seeing all of you again. God bless.